record. So welcome to the Francis Humphrey Lecture Series. We have the pleasure today of having Pat Crane speak about her book, Casino Sidemen, which, you know, we all know that there were great musicians that came through the Reno casinos, but who were those guys playing behind them in the orchestra? So that's what this book is about. Pat Crane is a musician herself. She learned to play the violin as a child in St. Louis, Missouri, and left following her marrying her career military husband. And they moved around a lot and eventually settled in Reno, Nevada, where she is a freelance musician and you know, is involved in different things in Reno and the music culture. And so I decided to have this program be part of the Jazz and Beyond Music Festival that is going virtually right now. So yay. So thank you very much, Pat, for being here, and I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Well, thank you, and welcome to my home. As she said, my name is Pat Crane. I came to Nevada, came to Reno in 2001. My husband's dad had been stationed at Stead Air Force Base back in the days, and he always loved this area more than any other after living all over the world. And so he said, oh, Pat, just give it a try. We'll pretend that it's just a military tour, and we'll spend a couple of years there, and if you don't like it, we'll move on. So that was in 2001, and we're still here. So I guess we liked it. And while we were here in the early 2000s, I started a degree in musicology at UNR and finished that up too. So this project actually came on the tail end of that education. I wanted a little, after I graduated, I wanted a little project to kind of get me started. And about the time I was thinking about what that project should look like, I was hired to play with Frank Sinatra Jr. He came to the Herreras up at the lake, and my stand partner was a former casino musician in what I call the booming years between 1950 and 1990, when the orchestras were large, the type of entertainment called for large ensembles. And so he was from that era. He talked me through the do's and don'ts as we went along, and I didn't recognize a lot of the other musicians in the orchestra I was playing with, especially on the wind side. And I noticed that the people I was used to playing classical music with, there were a handful of them, but these were other people that I did not recognize. And I came to find out that they were mostly former casino musicians, and they moved in circles other than the ones I was in. They were playing more jazz, they were playing more pop, they were just doing a little bit different type of music. And I started talking to these people about their experiences as casino showroom musicians, and the stories just fascinated me. So I finally formally interviewed a couple who had played. And I went back to the professor who was going to help me kickstart this project, and I couldn't even finish a sentence. I was so excited. And then they're telling me about doing this, and oh, you know, they had to cite, and I just couldn't barely describe what I was, you know, what I was discovering. And he says, Pat, this is not an article, this is a book. So The Kiss of Death, I had to write a book. So one of the things that fascinated me about coming to the Reno area and doing this casino gig was the quality of music and the diverse choices of music in the Reno area. I mean, and I'm going to go to a slide presentation that kind of follows along the things I'm talking about. It's mostly an outline to help me keep my place, but it also has some pictures in it that follow along as well. So I'm going to go to that now. And I'm going to go back to making this. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. And so my first slide. So some of the presence, I call it, musical presence in Reno included the Philharmonic, the chamber orchestra, the Love of Jazz group, the quality, high quality of the school education music programs. wedding ensembles that were playing music. Many of these organizations and choices of music came from former casino musicians. They were the ones who started these. They were the ones who filled the seats initially. And I only discovered that that's why that musical presence for a town the size of Reno, it had baffled me why this musical presence was so large and so wonderful until I started talking to these casino musicians and realizing they were attracted to these jobs from all over the country. It was good pay. Yeah, they thought it was going to last forever. And so many of them came here and settled in the area. And when the jobs started to dry up, they just decided many of them decided they were going to stay. So as I started the project, I decided to do a series of chapters about these casino musicians, and every chapter revolves around their jobs. So I have a chapter in there, for example, about the entertainers. I didn't want to know about Frank Sinatra's background. I wanted to know about his interaction with the casino musicians. So every chapter relates to them. And the first chapter is about why this became a showroom town. So, the early history, I won't get into much of the detail. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, through these series. But the first reason that people were attracted to being entertained started with the miners. And then you had the railroad system being built in the 1860s. You had ranchers here. And you had the university, which moved here from Elko in 1885. You ended up having what was called the divorce colony. This was a big one, and this was one of the real direct attractions to live entertainment in the Reno area. So in 1861, you had a residency requirement in different states that said you had to live in a certain state for so long before you could apply for and receive a divorce. And in 1861, Nevada became the shortest residency requirement at 6 months. They were kind of in competition with South Dakota, and in 1861, they became the shortest. So people from all over the country came to this area to seek those divorces. And because they had to sit around for 6 months, they wanted to party. They wanted to be entertained. So they sought options in that area too. So businesses started to develop that were trying to meet those entertainment needs. Now on the other side of that, you also had a city that offered faster marriages, and you had chapels, and you had easier to get a license and to get to proceed with a marriage. You also had people who were seeking health treatments and came to this area starting in the early 1900s. Because it's a drier area, people were coming here for tuberculosis, and they would travel to Reno. They would go up to Lake Tahoe, and that was how they would, again, they had to spend a lot of time here for these treatments. And then, of course, a premier in that is gambling, which was legal off and on until it was completely legalized in 1931. And what that means is that, you had a town and you had people who were here for the railroads or for other attractions, other reasons. And they would say, oh, this gambling, it's horrible. It's so embarrassing to be in a town where so much sin is present. And so all of the gambling facilities that had their windows, open, and people would be able to come right in and gamble on the first floor. When it was illegal, they'd move it to the second floor, and it would be out of sight for a while, and then it'd be legal again, and they'd come back down to the first floor, and so back and forth. And, around the gambling, as we know even to the present, we see that people wanted to come in and you wanted to attract people to the casino floors, anything at all to attract them to the casinos. So that was some of the primary businesses and history that brought entertainment to this area. And so you have a stage set now for showrooms to begin. And they actually, the concept, as we began to know it, began in Elko at the commercial casino in 1941. The owner there, Crumley's Commercial Casino, had Ted Lewis. I don't know if you remember him. He's the one who would always say, "Is everybody happy?" So he came and he performed at the commercial casino, and the show was sold out. So you had this star appear, and he was very popular, and the concept of having shows in a casino took off, and it spread to Reno. And so eventually you're going to have the stage set for the showroom shows that we are more familiar with, more closer to our current time. And of course, over time, Vegas also became one of those casino towns as well. They were quite a ways behind Reno in developing the casinos and that, but once they did get going, they actually, as you know, passed us by and had more overall entertainment business than we did by the 1960s. And so when I was interviewing casino musicians, many of them played between Reno and Las Vegas. They would, some of them lived in Vegas for a while and decided they wanted to move elsewhere, so they would come up here. I actually interviewed one gentleman. He had quite the resume. He was from Minnesota, and he had done it all. Glenn Miller, he'd done the Dorsey Brothers, he played all of them. So he said he and his wife decided they were gonna move west. And he didn't want to travel so much with some of these bands, so he wanted to play with the casinos. He said he and his wife came to Las Vegas. He'd heard that was the place to get a job. So he says, we got out of the car, it was 112 degrees, dust was blowing everywhere, and we looked at each other. They had no children or anything. They're very flexible in their plans. And we looked at each other and said, do we really want to live here? So they both nodded no, and they got in the car and they said, we also heard about this place called Lake Tahoe. So we came up there and settled into an apartment, and there they were. So they didn't actually have the playing experience that some of these folks did in Vegas, but they knew enough to leave. So anyway, but I thought it was interesting when the musicians would compare notes between playing in those two cities. Even though it could be the same entertainers in the showrooms, the jobs were different. They actually did receive better pay and better benefits for the musicians in Las Vegas than they did in Reno. But the whole atmosphere, they said, in Vegas was very competitive. And they described it, talking about the other musicians, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I want to quote one of the musicians I interviewed about playing in Vegas. He said, well, they got a lot of people with personality quirks, but who had professional careers. Most of them couldn't handle a team effort in an orchestra. They were soloists, and they ended up in Vegas. Speaking from a string perspective, a violinist added, there were 12 concert masters in Las Vegas. Everybody thought they were the best, and there wasn't any feeling of teamwork. And I heard that quite often between the musicians about Vegas, that they were soloists in their mind, and that it was a little more of a family atmosphere in Reno. So I found that difference quite interesting. People ask now, why are the showroom shows so different today? You don't see these full orchestras. You don't see the same type of a showroom performance that you did in those booming years. Why is that? And I actually don't think it's a single thing. I think it's a series of things. And one of them, you can't really get away from, is that the music itself changed. You went from these Frank Sinatras and Williams and Sammy Davis and all these people who had full orchestra sounds behind them to self-contained groups that were just smaller. And so they didn't need the same type of background. And then you also had Bill Herrera, who I'm going to talk about in a minute more detail. But as a casino owner, Bill Herrera was very, very supportive of the showroom shows. And he would do anything to promote them and to support them. And the musicians, many said when Bill Herrera died, that was the end of it. It went from a person like Bill Herrera who supported these and was willing to, one of Bill Herrera's philosophies was, you know, spend a lot of money on the show, and the people who come in for the show are also going to spend money on the gaming floor, which is the bottom line. That's why you're doing them in the first place. And I don't care if I spend extra money on the show and I even lose money on the show. If I get them into the casino and they're gonna spend it at the slot machines, they're gonna spend their money in the lounges, they're gonna spend it at the restaurants and all these others. So he was willing to even lose money in certain departments if it was gonna be made up in other areas. And then you had corporate owners come in after Herrera was gone, and the musicians, called them the bean counters, came in with the corporate owners, and they would say, no, this department has to be self-supporting. If it loses money, it's done. And so they weren't going to run things the same way. And that's when the lounges started to close first. And eventually the showrooms were not run the same. Some of them started to close as well. And then you also had headliners who came in, these entertainers who demanded more and more money. And they wanted larger and larger venues. And so like Herrera's in Reno downtown, it's a small showroom. It only seats so many people. So they wanted more lucrative, larger venues. And so they wanted, you know, stadiums, or they wanted television, which was much more lucrative than the showrooms too. And you didn't have to do the traveling from one showroom to the next. So that was a part of it too. The casino owners were not willing to pay these salaries and a full orchestra behind them. And then you had casinos that were built elsewhere in the country as well. So they were going to all look a little bit different. And then finally, you had more and more recorded and synthesized music. So you didn't need a live musician. And when the recorded and synthesized music first came out, you had a listener's ear that would be able to say, oh, that's not live, that's not a real musician. And they could discern between the types of music. But then over time, those listeners' ears changed and they were less and less able to discern the difference. I do remember Bev Colgan, who's a local harpist here, said that at one time when they were creating the synthesized sounds and they were able to pretty well mimic all of the different instruments, the last instrument they were able to synthesize, she said, was the harp. And so there were times where she remembered sitting in an orchestra, she was the live orchestra, the rest of the sound was synthesized. And then eventually they picked up the harp as a sound as well. So first thing I want to talk about in terms of the showroom jobs themselves is some of the differences between the orchestras, the showroom ensembles. And I want to compare two types of showroom ensembles, and then I want to compare showroom bands to lounge acts and to classical jobs, classical orchestra jobs, because it is a very unique culture, and the job itself is completely different. The difference, one of the two types of ensembles that played in these casino showrooms were what they called the house band, and that was the standing band. It was sort of like, you know, we know we're going to need this 12 people, this group of 12 people on a pretty regular basis. They're going to be the house band. And we're going to call them, and we may need to add a few people now and then. We may need to subtract a few people now and then, but this is our core group of people, and they're going to play 6 days a week. And then they started giving them a night off, so they got that 7th day off, and they needed a band that would travel between one casino to the next casino and play during that night off. And so their job every single night, the relief band they were called, or they were also called the 7th night band because that was the night the house band was off. That relief band, every time they came into the next night into a showroom, they played all different music because it was another entertainer. It wasn't the one they had the night before. And then they would go up to Herrera's at the lake, and they would play with a different entertainer. So they were reading new music every single night, and they would just sit down and play it. And they had to play it like they'd been playing it all their lives. So I would say that both the house band and the relief band, and I'll describe why that is, had to be very, very versatile. They had to be very good at just sitting down and reading the music and not having a lot of preparation. It's pretty impressive to hear how they did that, and convincingly night after night. When you talk to the musicians, they would not say they worked in a casino. They would say that they were in entertainment. They worked in live entertainment, but they passed through the casino on their way to work. It just happened to be that they passed all those gambling tables and all that stuff. That was, that was the scenery on the way to work, but they didn't associate themselves as being casino employees. And then now, in comparison to lounge and classical orchestra jobs, the lounge musicians who played would play the same show night after night after night. And when they were done playing at one casino, they might be hired for weeks, they might be hired for months. Then they'd go to another spot and they would play the same music over and over and over too. So the music was very familiar, very accessible for them. Now, as far as a classical orchestra job, when I'm hired or I play with an orchestra, I'm given the music ahead of time. I'm usually given it at least a week ahead, if not 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. So I have time to look the music over, run through any hard spots. I get it. That was not the case with the showroom musicians. They had 2 to 4 hour rehearsals on the first day of the show. And most casino showroom shows were 2-week blocks in those days. So if Anne Margaret came to town, she was there for 2 weeks, then she'd go somewhere else and somebody else would come in for 2-week block. And so the first day of their show, the musicians had a 2 to 4 hour rehearsal. And then that evening at 7:35, they played dinner music. And then they had the first show that they called it the dinner show because they served dinner with it at 8 o'clock. The second show was called the cocktail show, and it started at 11:30. Now, some entertainers, particularly on weekends for very popular entertainers, they would have an extra show, a third show, and it would start at 2 a.m. So these musicians had a long, pretty grueling work day, especially that first day. From the time they rehearsed. And I mean, they had to be on top of it. They could not sit back and relax. They had to really be on top of their game. And it was especially difficult for those who were teaching during the day. Many of these musicians were teaching in the local schools as well as these casino jobs. And they actually, like I said, these musicians thought these jobs were going to be for forever. But the ones who taught, they had the last laugh, really, because when these jobs started to dry up, the ones who were teaching still had a job, and years later had a retirement, whereas the ones who were not teaching or didn't have other jobs, it was just done. But it was a hard life. Think about it. They had to get up and go to school, and then they had to do all this that I have listed, for that evening. So it was tough. And one of the stories I heard from one of the musicians, the little things on my slides that are in red are just to remind me that I want to tell you a little story that one of the musicians told me. And one of them was one of those musicians who happened to teach during the day. And he said during one of the shows, and it happened to be the opening act before Eddie Arnold, and that's why Eddie Arnold's on the bottom there. The opening act, he was comedian, and the way they used to do the showrooms for comedians was when the comedian would come onto stage, the band members would play music as they walked on. Then they would close the curtain and the comedian would do their act in front of the curtain, and the band members could do whatever they wanted. They could rest, they could go to the band room and just relax for a while. They could do, they couldn't talk because you had to be quiet, but they could kind of let their hair down a little bit. And then when the comedian was over, was finishing up, they had to be in their seats, and when the curtain opened again, they played that comedian back off the stage again. So as they walked off the stage, they had music. Of course, that wasn't, you know, not every entertainer was a comedian. You had singers, you had dancers, you had Broadway performances and all that. But anyway, this particular night, there was a comedian performing before Eddie Arnold's show was coming on. And this comedian did not feel well, so he decided he was going to cut his act really short. And the musicians thought they had a pretty good sense of how long this comedian would be, because he'd been performing other nights, and they sort of know how long it's going to take them. Well, it wasn't the same that night because he didn't feel well, so he cuts his show drastically short. The curtain opens up, nobody's in their place. One of the musician who told me the story was somebody who taught during the day. He was taking a nap and he was draped across 3 chairs, sleeping. And you know, the word got back to the band room that the curtain was open, and he said people started piling into their chairs and getting, you know, ready to play as fast as they could. And this fellow had to wake up and you know, get to his seat. So he said it left a few you know, extra gray hairs for some people. All right. As I said, there's not as much rehearsal time compared to those other types of jobs. There was no access to the music ahead of time. You were not giving your music. In fact, the music, sheets of music belonged to the entertainer, and they carried them from town to town when they performed. So you weren't going to see the music ahead of time at all. And you weren't going to be able to take it home between the shows and work out anything that was especially difficult for you. And you had to be very versatile, because you're going to have a country western singer come in one night. You're going to have a Broadway person come in the next night, or I mean the next block. You're going to have it, you know, any type of music out there, you better be ready for. So you had to be very versatile. And I had one musician just describing the workplace itself. He says, well, number one, they gave you no room to play. You were on the stage and you're all crammed together, and especially string players, we kind of need room to move our arms and bows. And so he said, we had no room to play. Number two, they gave you no light to play with. And number three, it was so loud you couldn't hear yourself play. But other than that, it was a great job. And it also was a unique job. I would say that playing with the Philharmonic or the chamber orchestra, I can honestly say I've not been on stage with an alcohol drink of, you know, anything in front of me. That would not be allowed. But for the most part, now there were exceptions, but for the most part, these musicians could have alcohol on stage with them, and that was a part of the job. So I'm going to talk about Bill Herrera. As I said, he was, and obviously there were other casino owners I talk about in the book. I do talk about John Esquaga, and I talk about other folks, but Bill Herrera was a very unique character, and I want to spend a little time introducing him a little more. You know, he first came in here, he worked with his father initially. That's quite a young picture of him. I was kind of happy to see here. He kind of changed his look over time. You know, he grew his hair out a little bit during the 70s and 60s, and changed his looks a little bit. But he was responsible for some real changes to the Reno area and Tahoe. He had the casino in Reno downtown, and he had one at South Shore. The South Shore Room started in 1959. He thought he was going to get a lot of business with the Olympics. He didn't really discover that it was a big attraction for the Olympic attendees. It did all right. It wasn't what he was hoping, but it took a while for him to kind of develop what he wanted to see. And I would say a lot of changes that he made happened up at the Tahoe area. He actually made some changes to the airports. He made changes to the roads. He was real big on removing snow. I mean, it wasn't that he was just such a nice guy. It was all about running this business. And so he wanted to improve that airport so people could fly in and come to his casino. He wanted to make sure those roads were clear. And he also started what was called a bus program. He would send buses to Greyhound buses to various cities, particularly west of us. So he sent, there was a regular one that went to San Francisco, but he sent them all the way up to Vancouver. And he would bring people, they'd open the doors and they'd say, does anybody want to go to Reno for the day? And we've got free chicken dinners, a box lunch sitting on the seat. And we're going to give you tokens to get free drinks and a couple of slot machine tokens, and you're good to go. And it's all on us. You know, you just go, you just play games. So they ran this bus, and at the peak of it, they had 4 to 6 buses running at any given time. So this guy was promoting what he was trying to sell. He was, you know, he was really going after it. He also started it was initially called the Reno Carnival Room. Started in 1966, it became Sammy's Room, and we're going to talk more about Sammy Davis in a bit. But Sammy was he did a lot of shows for Herrera, so it was no surprise that that Herrera named his showroom after Sammy Davis. We know that Bill Herrera had a large auto collection, and he loved his shows, and he really took care of his entertainers. And in relation to that auto collection, one of the things he used to do is he would, not everybody who came to play in the showrooms, but for a lot of them, he would give them the keys to one of the cars out of his collection. And it might be and some of the big names, he would just let them keep the keys, and it was their vehicle after that. Some very nice vehicles. He had lots of perks. He had special houses that were set aside just for the entertainers as they stayed in a town. There was one in Reno on Nixon Street. It had a built-in pool. It had tennis courts. He told his entertainers, you get up at 2 a.m. and you want a sandwich, the kitchen is going to make you a sandwich. Anything they wanted except prostitutes, he was going to provide. But he had some rules, and he was kind of quirky about some of the things. He loved gadgets. He loved, he was the one who had the bells go off on the slot machines at first, and that kind of caught on. Other casinos started doing that. He liked all that stuff. And he had gauges to check how loud, the decibel level of the shows. And one of the other things he did was they said he was sort of, one of the musicians said he was kind of Mussolini-like in the way he ran his shows. They had to be no more than 1.5 hours long. Why would he be so concerned about how long they were? Well, because it wasn't about the show, it was about getting them to the gaming floor. So if they decided they were really enjoying themselves on stage and wanted to make their show last for 2.5 hours, that was an hour beyond his cutoff of when they should be out on the gaming floor. So he had a red light on the stage that would light up when your time was up. And it wasn't the same as the hook that would pull you off the stage, but it was darn close to that. I mean, you knew if you were going to entertain in Herrera's showroom, you would better follow the rules. The other thing he did, and this always, always amused the musicians, is he had a countdown. They used to check, they'd check with Greenwich time, and they'd make sure that the show started on the 2nd. So they do a countdown, 5, 4, and at 0, the baton came down on for the conductor, and the orchestra started playing. So it started right on time. And, I know musicians who played other casinos said, we might be 10, 15, even 20 minutes late start in some of these casinos. Not at Bill Herrera's. He was very particular about how things were run. He also detested unions, and he did not want any of his workers to join unions, form unions in the Reno area. In fact, he didn't start a casino in Vegas himself, because Vegas was more of a union town than Reno. And he was afraid that if he started one down there and his workers joined the union, then the ones up here would follow suit. So he decided he wasn't going to build down there. In fact, his musicians were the only ones on his payroll who were union members. That was not true of every casino in Reno, but it was true of Bill Herrera. Okay, Don't know how I skipped, but okay. All right. The conductors, you had two types of conductors. You had the house conductors, and just like the house musicians, they were a stable force. They were on staff, you could say, at the casino. And like they would conduct the dinner music that was just like a 15, 20-minute little piece of music that they would play while dinner was being served. So the house conductors would do that. And they were a stable person. They didn't generally change. But then you also had conductors who traveled with entertainers. Now, some entertainers didn't bring conductors with them. Some used the house conductor to conduct their music, particularly the comedians, because they were just going to be played on and off the stage. But some traveled with the entertainers. Particularly ones like dancers, they wanted their own conductors who knew their ways, knew their steps, and their music very well. And so these versatile musicians had to get used to a different conductor many times. They had a 2-week block, and they might get a completely different style of conductor the next time. And you're talking about a room that's real smoky. It's kind of dark. Everybody's dressed in black on the stage. It's kind of hard to see some of these conductors, and they're not that close because the way they're seated, well, you can even see in my picture that conductor is not terribly close to some of those musicians off in the corners. And so it's a stretch to see some of them. And so the musicians began to rely more and more on what they heard rather than what they saw. The conductors were sort of more decorative, and they would kind of kick things off. But after that, the musicians learned that I hear the drum doing this beat, and that must be the beat because that's what the audience is going to hear. They don't care what the conductor is doing. The audience knows what they're hearing. So they followed the sounds of the percussion and the bass. Plus, some of these conductors even conducted from the piano, so they're seated as well. And, very, very difficult to see. Now, a lot of times the conductors that came had big band experience, or they had experience doing jazz. They didn't have a whole lot of experience with string musicians. So in terms of rehearsing, in terms of interacting with them, and we'll talk about in terms of composing for them, they didn't have quite the experience that they could have had. It made it a little challenging for some of the string musicians to play with them. And then you had some of these conductors who are conducting from a basement at the MGM at that time, the Grand Sierra Resort now. But they were doing that show, Hello Hollywood, Hello, and it was on this huge stage, and the orchestra was underneath the stage in a little basement room. They were not in person. They could not physically see the stage. And so they used monitors. They had little television sets that they would look at. And the conductors and the drummers, those two, had what they call click tracks. And it was a set of earphones that would count down when the music should start. And it would be like Herrera's. It would say 5, or it would click 2. And so they knew 5, 4, 3, 2, and then they would start. The conductor would start and the drummer would start together. So I interviewed a fellow who had played the Hello Hollywood show, and he talked about how a lot of these conductors who traveled with the entertainers were not accustomed to conducting from a basement and a monitor and a click track, and it just, it totally rattled a lot of them. And this particular drummer, Joe Venuto, was talking about it. He said these conductors were unaccustomed to relying on click tracks and a TV monitor rather than live visual cues. He chuckled as he described one conductor, completely spooked by the whole thing, as he accompanied comedian Phyllis Diller. The conductor attempted in vain to communicate with his famous boss through the TV monitor in the downstairs room. He's trying to talk through the TV screen. Phyllis, I'm talking to you. Phyllis, can you hear me? She didn't hear him. Since this conductor was not alone in his agitation, this particular musician reminisced how we'd get such a big kick out of watching these big shots get all confused. So it was a very unique experience for many of them. And you know, you had these traveling conductors. Some of them were brilliant. Some of them were very good. Others were horrible. You know, the musicians said they must have really gotten a bargain on that one. They must have just plucked that person right off the street. And so they would joke about the way they conducted. They'd say they're confidential beats, as in nobody knew what they were trying to indicate with their conducting, or their alleged downbeats. Was that where he wants us to start? It was just not clear. But no matter how good or bad that traveling conductor was, they could still go to the casino owners and they could have a musician fired, because that was the hierarchy. They were a higher status. They had more power than the musicians. And if something about them upset this conductor, they could go to the owners and have them fired. And if you were fired, you were just done. There was no job security. You did not sign a contract. You were hired for a 2-week block to 2-week block. If you were even in the house band, you were hired for that 2 weeks. You might not be needed the next 2 weeks because they just didn't need an oboe player or a cello. And you might be hired the next one. So there were no contracts. It was just 2 week to 2 week. So, it was very precarious in terms of security. Now the audiences were kind of interesting. They, the musicians said that they kind of, they sat up on the stage facing the audience. So they got to study their audience members, and they watched them as they ate and as they, watched the show, and they called it a sociology study. And they had their groupies and all that other stuff. And I had one violinist tell me a story about being in an elevator with Elvis Presley. She said that she happened to enter an elevator, and it was Elvis and his promoter. Remember the Colonel who used to, go with him? And she said, I was sort of like a fly on the wall in that elevator, and Presley was talking to the Colonel, and she said he was very upset. She said he was not flattered by the screaming and yelling and throwing those panties on the stage. That wasn't what he was after. He thought of himself as a singer, and he was unhappy that night. They were making so much noise, they weren't listening to his singing. They weren't paying attention to his singing at all, and he was quite hurt by that. He was a lot more sensitive than people ever knew. When people go and automatically just assume that all of that yelling and screaming makes the star happy, it's not necessarily so. So I thought that was an interesting story, coming from a person who certainly got a lot of reaction from his audience. Now in the showroom, the showrooms themselves, many of the fans and the audience members were older. And there's actually a reason. If you think about what kind of business this was, they would bring in stars that they knew attracted, hopefully a little bit older audience, because those were the folks who had money on the gaming floor. So they had a particular formula to use. And so that was the clientele they were often focusing upon. But when these audience members came, they expected to hear the recordings they were used to hearing. So if they came in and they said, you know what, there's supposed to be a clarinet there, and they didn't bring a clarinet in there, they knew what to expect because they'd heard the recordings. And so when the orchestras were being formed and they were hiring for seats in these orchestras, they knew the entertainers would say, here's a list of the people we're going to need for my performance. And it had to be to meet the needs of those ears of their audience members who expected to hear what they heard on their recordings. Now, a lot of the audience types paralleled the stars who were on the stage. So if you had a country western singer, you were going to have a particular kind of audience. If you had a Broadway singer, you were going to have a particular kind of audience. And so I heard a couple of stories about how those parallels occurred. So I was interviewing, what was his name? I can't think of his name right now. He was a conductor up at Herrera's at the lake, Brian Farnan. And his wife had been she was a waitress in the showroom at Herrera's as well. And so she's the one who was telling me about one time Willie Nelson came to perform at the showroom up there. And she said, she was talking about after the show was over and they're cleaning the room up. They have to, you know, clear out all the dishes and everything. And so she and this other waitress are out there. And this one waitress was distributing the beer. And she said, I walked out on stage and she said, every table except one, and I had 9 tables, was overturned. This was after the show. Bottles were all over the place. She said a friend of mine, another waitress, was hit by somebody who was throwing a bottle. And she said, we found drugs all over the place. One musician described these crowds as rowdy and said, you know, these were supposed to be, you know, a particular kind of audience member, but they were there to spend a lot of money, but you know, you didn't know what you were going to get from one entertainer to the next. In fact, the same waitress was telling me, Steve Martin, you remember he used to wear the arrow on his head? And she talked about how she'd be serving meals and she kept getting poked by these arrows all night. So she would, she'd have to kind of walk carefully. You also had a lot of audience participation at sometimes, and that depended on the entertainer themselves. Some of the entertainers didn't want the audience members to sing with them and, you know, and to engage with them. Others would go out into the audience and ask questions. John Davidson was big on that. He would ask who has an anniversary, who has a birthday, that kind of thing. And he would have music really geared towards the answers he got. But one night, this was at John Ascuaga's Nugget, Nancy Sinatra came to the showroom. You remember what her top hit was? These boots are made for walking. So she comes to John Ascuaga's Nugget, and it happened to be a particular event that John had put together. He had this annual golf tournament, and it was a fundraiser, and he would invite big cattlemen, auto dealers. He had bankers. He had some of the top money makers in the area come to this golf tournament, and then they would come to a dinner and a show at his casino afterwards. So he invites all these high rollers over, and they're at this show, and Nancy Sinatra is going to be the entertainer that night. Well, it was a really, really hot day on the golf course, and I guess these golfers were kind of dehydrated, and they started drinking a lot. And they got real loud, and they're laughing and they're talking, and Nancy comes out to perform and they're still making a lot of noise. So finally she says, let's see. The musician is describing this scene, and he said, by the time the show starts, the lively crowd is half in the bag. Nancy Sinatra was not quite as experienced with fan behavior as her father, Frank. And she expected odd, quiet worship from the stage, beyond the stage. So it was really upsetting her. And she had this etiquette-challenged mob. And so they were not listening to her. And she says finally to them, I don't care if you're here for the golf tournament, she announced. You don't have to make all that noise out there. I'm trying to do a show here. She laid into that audience. After the show was over, John Ascuaga told her, I am never going to bring you back again. You never talk to my audiences that way. Very inappropriate. He never hired her again. So it was interesting to me when I was interviewing the musicians, about half the musicians I interviewed said they thought that that John Ascuaga was right. You know, the customer's always right. That he did the right thing. About half of them said, oh, they were so rude. Yeah, she said the right thing. She should have laid into him. So it was kind of interesting. They both had different, both sides kind of had different views. Okay, and I have a chapter, and as I said, I do like to relate how these topics have anything to do with my musicians that I was interviewing. And I can't leave out the union, because I said that this was something that they belonged to. They belonged to the local union 368. This particular union was founded in 1909. And I only know about the early years because when I went to the archives section of the University of Nevada University Library, they have boxes of all the union papers from the beginning on. And in 1909, I discovered, sort of as an aside, that they had an audition. If you were going to join the union, you had to audition first. And you had to play particular pieces. And they had a list of the pieces you had to play. And I found that kind of interesting because that made the assumption that if I'm a professional musician, I must read music. Now, there are many, many very accomplished musicians out there who do not read music. And so I thought that was interesting. They could not have joined the union in 1909. Now, the union was very active during the showroom years because there were a lot of people coming in. There were a lot of musicians in the area. There was a residency requirement. It changed over time, you know, how long you had to be here before you could join the union and become a professional musician in Reno. And it was just so that, you know, you couldn't take jobs away from people who had been here a long time. You could just blow into town and then go on through. And one of the interesting things that I heard about from the musicians had to do with disputes that occurred and led to strikes in Reno. And this disputes had to do with who was the boss. When the musicians union went to ask for pay raises for the casino musicians, they would usually go to the casino owners. And the casino owners started pointing their finger at some point and saying, no, 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 you're not supposed to talk to us. You're supposed to talk to the house conductors. They're the boss because they're the ones who hire and fire. They're the ones who physically hand out the paychecks. So they're the ones who handle pay raises as well. But when they went to the conductors said, no, no, we get our money from the casino owners from, you know, we work for them too. And so it became sort of this, which way are we supposed to go? And the whole thing was making it so that a decision was not being made about pay raises. And the little town of Reno made national news because this ruling and this issue had national relevance. I mean, in a situation where you have a facility and then you have a conductor that works for that facility, and then under that conductor you had musicians, who is the boss and who is supposed to make these decisions. So these issues went to court more times than once. And the main strikes, as I say here, is 1966 and 1968, the second one being much, much longer. And the musicians talked about being out of work for quite some time at that second one. And, you know, it was very interesting how that was tossed around the courts and actually a decision was made. So it did have national precedence. It actually is the casino owner. But anyway, yeah, very interesting, the influence. Now I want to talk about the entertainers, and as I said, only is related to the musicians themselves. And you'll probably recognize some of these entertainers up here. Phyllis Diller, Smokey Robinson. Do you recognize Smokey in the corner there? Mm-hmm. But the one I want to highlight more than anything is this one I have along, this entertainer I have along the bottom. The top picture of him in the suit that's out in the desert is a younger year. But the one on the bottom is with a casino musician, Gordy Anderson, and Sammy's not doing well there. He had cancer, and he was quite ill there, so he doesn't look as good there. Anyway, when I was interviewing musicians, and I interviewed dozens of these musicians, the person they would invariably talk about, just like they looked at and watched their audience members and sort of did a sociology study on the audiences, they also did a study of the entertainers that they worked under. What made an entertainer effective? How accessible were they to me as an individual playing behind them? You know, did they welcome? Did they talk to me? Did they interact with me? How versatile were they? Did they use props? How were they? And the one name that I heard over and over was Sammy Davis. He was quite an icon in their eyes, and being all of those things. He was extremely versatile, And the example that I was given was kind of a fun story. It happened that Merle Haggard was scheduled to appear at Herrera's in Reno, downtown Reno, and he had to cancel at the last minute. And so, I mean the last minute. So the entertainment department is scurrying around trying to figure out who to put in his slot. And it just so happened that Sammy Davis was just coming off of a 2-week block at another casino, and he said he would do it. He would come in, but it was so last minute that even the audience was going to be told. They were going to come in and find out when Sammy hit the stage. So, you know, very, very unexpected. So I had a musician describing it, and he said that Sammy Davis comes out on the stage, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you were expecting the Okie from Muskogee, but you've got the little black Jew from Beverly Hills." Now, this musician said that Sammy Davis, he was so versatile. He could come up with any song he chose, and his repertoire was huge, and it did include country western music, so he could pull those out for that particular audience. In fact, Sammy was one of the only entertainers who would come in and he would decide what he was going to sing on the spot. And he would decide based on the chemistry of his audience. And so he would decide, okay, he had this great big book he would come in with, big black book, and the musicians would stick it on their music stand. And Sammy's conductor knew his ways so well that when Sammy was talking to his audience, he would say, okay, I heard this song 20 years ago in New York. It's always been one that I've felt close to my heart. I've really loved. And his conductor would lean over his stand and he'd whisper to the musicians out of the book. Every piece is numbered. So he'd say number 94, and they'd all turn to 94. And so when Sammy was ready to sing, they're at 94. They start playing the music with him. And then after that's done, Sammy would start talking again, and the conductor would figure out what was next, and he'd say number 23. So they'd turn to 23 and they'd play that one. But this particular night, when he was substituting for Merle Haggard, he pulled out a lot of the music that he thought this audience would want to hear. So this musician said, those country fans who had come to see Merle Haggard gave Sammy Davis a standing ovation at the end of the show. He demonstrated extreme versatility. He knew how to read his audiences. He was, in fact, he was only a handful of entertainers, as I said, who would make decisions on the spot about what he was going to do. And he was so versatile. He could dance, he could sing, he interacted with his audience. And he also recognized the band's role. Some of the entertainers who would come completely ignored the band behind them. They wouldn't introduce them. They wouldn't acknowledge them at all. But Sammy and some of the entertainers were really wonderful about making sure that these folks got credit for what they did too. And if you think about it, that band can make or break that person's performance. I mean, if you really mess it up, that entertainers, no matter how good their voice is not going to sound good. So, Sammy was one of those people who recognized that. He had the incredible personality and accessibility. He played poker with the musicians. And I don't know if you realize, but he had one glass eye from a car accident he'd been in. And so when he would play poker with the musicians, he would say, "One-eyed Jacks are wild." And they always knew, Sammy was going to call for that. Now, when he came to town, he was extremely generous, and he would do some special things for the musicians. He bought their television in their band room. He would host special dinners after the shows at the steakhouse at Herrera's. He would pay for having a duck brought in, having duck brought in for the dinner or whatever they wanted. And so one night he was joking with the musicians, and he said, "I'm always hosting these dinners for you. How come none of you are hosting them for me?" And so one violinist, actually two separate string players told me stories about hosting them to dinner, but this one, Marilyn, said she and her husband was a musician, a casino musician too, and they decided they were going to host him. So she said, "I'll host you. You can come to my house for dinner." And so she and her husband are driving home, and they're talking about having Sammy for dinner, and her her husband turns to her and says, you know, he's Jewish. I wonder if he has any special dietary restrictions, or we probably should ask, you know, and make sure that we get this right. So the next night, she goes up to him at the show, and she says, let's see, the next night we're going to the stage. So they're going to, she says, Sammy, do you have any restrictions on your diet? He says, oh no, I'd eat a rabbi if he was handsome. So she said that he came to dinner. She lived on kind of a farm, and he came out and looked at the horses and stuff. She said he always came with an entourage. Wherever he went, he had a group of people who went with him. And so the entourage came to dinner. She said it was really, really nice. So very, very, as I said, very accessible. And one of the things he used to do is he would do an extra show that started at 2 a.m. and it was just for casino employees. So it wasn't one where they sold tickets. And because it was for employees, there was no time limit. These things, one of the musicians talked about, it started at 2, it ended at 5:15 in the morning. And he would pack the room. They said they used to have ladders up against the wall, and people would be up the rungs of the ladder and watching him do these shows. So generous with his time. I had one musician who was a strings teacher, and he told her it was okay if she brought her strings students to watch them rehearse one day. And she said he came out and talked to her students, interacted with them, extremely, extremely accessible and pleasant. So I had to mention him. Now, in terms of the stage setting, these stages varied from one casino to the next, and you know, to be on a stage night after night with such difference in shows, one block to the next, you never knew what was going to happen. The same woman who I mentioned before, Bev Colgan, who plays the harp, says, well, you know, I don't remember anything except everybody's backside, because she was in the back of the orchestra. All she saw was everybody's back. But on stage, you could have a Broadway set. You could have an ice rink, which they talked about. It was cold. And you could have animals. Now, of course, John Esquaga was known for having elephants at his casino. Bertha and Tina, and they would have a special little section where these elephants would come out and do a little act. And you also had sometimes dinner music. Before they had dinner music, they used to have review shows. So they would do dancing. They would have monkeys doing different acts and things like that. And because you're doing live acts with live animals, you never knew what was going to happen. And the stories I heard about those, about the monkeys, I heard about a time they said they were at the Riverside, and it was a review show, and they had these 3 little chimpanzees who were riding on bicycles in a circle, and they're going around the stage real fast, and they're playing Rossini's Overture to accompany them going in this little circle. And they said that the tables where they were eating their dinner, the audience was eating their dinners watching this show, the tables went all the way up to the stage. And so some of these people were eating dinner right up against the end of the stage. Well, apparently one of the chimpanzees that was riding this bicycle decided that the dinner looked pretty good. And as they're riding along, just on one circle, this chimp grabs a baked potato and just keeps going and rides on. So you never knew what was going to happen with live animals. In terms of the elephants, there was one night they were talking about the showgirls of these review shows, or the chorus lines. They would also, there would be one who was set aside to work with the elephants, and they would dress in these real fancy glittery outfits, and they would stand, like in the case of Bertha, very, very smart, very tame, real wonderful elephant at John Squaggins Nugget. This woman who trained with him, she would stand on his trunk and she would hold on to the special bridle that they had, and the bridle was real pretty. It had all these jewels in it and everything. It was real fancy, and she'd hold on to that bridle, and then Bertha would turn around real fast and swing around with her holding onto the bridle while the band played this special music that went with the elephants. They said one night the bridle broke, And this was her lifeline. This is what she was hanging on to. And so when the strap broke, she started to fly out. She would have flown out into the audience. And Bertha was smart and quick enough. He grabbed her and kept her from flying out like that. So, you know, the stories, and I could tell you, I can't even tell you how many stories about animals I heard, especially about elephants. Many of them are in the book, and I continue to hear more to this day. So, like I said, it's live entertainment. As I said, the Hello Hollywood show was a huge, the largest stage in the world, almost the size of a football field. In fact, part of the show of Hello Hollywood was to bring out a 3/4 size DC-8. And the wings would fold up when they would move it around, but then they bring the wings down and people would dance on the wings and everything. They had one scene where it was a waterfall. They had one scene where it was a San Francisco earthquake. Huge stage, lots of props, big stuff. And as I said, the band was down below watching this on a monitor. Well, there were certain parts of that show that always stayed the same, but then there were little tiny acts between that would change, you know, month to month. It was, you know, it was like at one point they had an aerial artist, and that was one of the stories that one of these musicians told me about. This aerial artist was, you know, he would go do a trapeze act over the audience. And this same musician, Joe Venuto, was playing the drums in this basement. And his job was, when this aerial artist is flying around on his trapeze, Joe would do a drum roll. And he had to do it the entire time the guy was doing it. And he'd have to get a little bit louder and then a little quieter based on what the guy was doing on his act. And he was watching the monitor, and he would, you know, base it on what he saw. And of course, he'd done this every night for months. So he could do it in his sleep. Anyway, he said, one night I'm playing the timpani roll and I lose him. I kept rolling and I kept looking at the scene, and finally somebody came up and tapped me on the back and they whispered, "Stop." So I stopped. Everything came to a halt. Venuto learned that the performer's hands had slipped from the rope. He fell 30 feet into the audience. Now, Joe told me that this artist died the next morning, but I was giving one of these presentations at the Historical Society, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, "You know what? I knew that trapeze artist, and I knew him 30 years after that fall. He did live, and he did survive." And he said, you know, it was a horrible accident. He was badly injured, but anyway, you know, trying to do a drum roll, and he said, I was so embarrassed. The other band members were giving him a hard time afterwards. How could you keep playing the drums when this guy's, you know, laying in the audience? He said, I lost him.
Yeah.
There were other hazards of playing in these casinos, and the number one was that it was loud. And it wasn't just the kind of loud where you kind of hold your ears a little bit. No, nauseating, painful all the way through their bodies in some cases, just extremely, extremely loud. In fact, there was one musician, and if you think about it, these entertainers were doing this as a lifelong career. Their hearing was going to be impaired by doing that, right? So every show they did was going to affect their hearing over time. So what would happen is the monitors, the speakers on the stages for the entertainers kept getting cranked up louder and louder as they got older, so that they could hear the music that was accompanying them. I know Frank Sinatra wanted to hear the bass line more and more. That was what came through to him best. Well, some of them wanted it cranked up so loud, it became, as I said, painful. One of those entertainers was Engelbert Humperdinck, and he wanted everything extremely loud. So one night, this young string player, they would put earplugs in their ears, and they would, you know, they'd put cotton in their ears or whatever. But he decided, this guy was a young, new casino musician. He decides he's going to speak for the rest of the musicians. He's going to tell Engelbert, about the problem that the rest of them are having with the volume. So he goes up and he's on the sidelines before the show starts, and he starts talking to this performer and telling him how difficult it is for these musicians, this volume. And Engelbert is furious. So the show is getting ready to start, and this musician goes out to sit down in his seat, and the stage manager comes over and grabs him by the collar and says, "You're out of here." He had been fired on the spot because he spoke when he wasn't supposed to. And that's why I talk about job security. It wasn't all that big. But anyway, he thought he was doing the best thing for everybody else. But the other thing was that it was very dark, and they were on these risers, and there were electrical cords, there were lights, there were all kinds of, they had stand lights on each of their music stands. So if, for example, if they were playing a comedian on the stage and they got to go to the band room while they waited to play that person off the stage, they had to go out in the dark and try not to trip over these cords and things. And there were some accidents. I talk about some of those in the books, and of course the book, and they're carrying expensive instruments as well. So it was their physical well-being and their instruments well-being. And some of them had fog machines, they had water props. There were instruments that were damaged sometimes by water props that they had. You remember Liberace used to have a water prop, a little waterfall on his piano that he'd use. And there was a lot of smoke. This was in the days when people did a lot of cigarette smoking and cigar smoking. One of the musicians talked about, you could kind of tell what kind of audience you had based on the smoke in the rooms. He said, we could always tell what kind of group we were working for in the audience because of the smell and the style and the quality of the smoke. Were these high rollers? What kind of cigars were they smoking? So they could assess their audiences based on what they were smoking. Now the music itself, I told you already that it was going to be very versatile, and it came from a variety of sources. It came from it was impacted by vaudeville. It was impacted by Broadway, by radio, television, Hollywood, and big bands. Now, not all of those impact sources included strings. A lot of the big band orchestras, some of them had strings, a lot of them did not. Vaudeville acts might or might not have strings. Hollywood and Broadway tended to have strings. Those composers were more comfortable writing for strings. But a lot of the composers who wrote for these entertainers in the showrooms had no experience whatsoever in writing for strings. So you never knew as a string player what you were going to get. It might not really be very accessible on your instrument to be jumping around on a cello. And, these composers would say, well, I understand the ranges from here to here and anywhere in between. Well, they would just, they just didn't have a sense of how to do that. So these musicians had to be, again, very versatile with rhythms as well. A lot of these were classical, especially on the string side, they tended to be classical musicians. They weren't accustomed to jazz rhythms. They weren't accustomed to the different challenges that came from those. So they had to get used to that as well. And a lot of the music was handwritten. So it was not generated by a computer. It wasn't printed. It was handwritten. And you can see an example on my sheet here. And so they called it chicken scratch. They just had to figure out what it said. And oftentimes an entertainer would have that music. Like I said, they carried it from one show to the next. And they decide, you know what, I don't like that little section right there in the middle. Let's just chop that out. So make a little note in everybody's music that you're going to jump from this measure to this measure. So you're going to have this roadmap that just goes all over the place. It could jump around. Changes might be made. Don't make that change now. Erase it. And so things were always being added and taken away from the music. And on top of that, there developed a tradition where musicians would realize, you know what? This entertainer's going from Reno to Minneapolis, and I know a guy up in Minneapolis who's probably going to play this show. I'm going to write a note on my music. Hi, Steve. It's Bob. I'm in Reno. How are you doing? And so they started writing each other notes on the music until finally the union and the entertainers and everybody put a stop to that. But the music was very difficult to read. So not only were you seeing it without any preparation, but it was handwritten, and it was very, very difficult to navigate through it. Other hazards of the job, I already mentioned that they could have alcohol on the premises, on the stage, and alcohol was around them all over the place. And so a lot of them ended up having problems with alcohol. Drugs were something that you saw. Not too many of them had problems with gambling, which kind of came as a surprise to me based on where they were, but maybe they took that literally about walking through the casino. And I didn't see as much of that, but I did hear stories about the drugs and the alcohol sometimes being a problem. The other thing they commented about was sustaining their musical skills. You were playing in a casino in a very loud environment, and particularly ones who played between the casino showrooms and the Philharmonic or the chamber orchestra said they had to really refine their skills between the two places, because they in the casinos it was so loud. For example, one of the things string players do, and they shouldn't, but they do, when it's really loud and they can't hear themselves, they play a little high, they play a little sharp, and so they're technically out of tune, but it's the only way they can hear themselves above all the other. And so when they went back to playing in the Philharmonic or whatever, they had to start playing their scales again and getting those notes back into tune. And they also had to change their bow technique. They were so used to grinding away the notes, they had to have a little finesse. Oh, I have to play softly here. I'm not used to doing that. And the other thing they had to do in the showroom is they had to develop what was called a Sideman mentality. By the way, I've used this Sideman even in the title of my book, and I've never really told you what it means. It has to do with a supporting musician. And it's usually used as a union term, and it has to do with your pay scale. You're not the conductor, you're not the primary entertainer, you're not the soloist, you're the supporting musician. And so, you know, technically you're a sideman if you're playing in an orchestra as well. But having a sideman mentality, some of these folks came from lounge acts. They came from some, like I said, in Vegas, a lot of them had been soloists. And they had to realize it was not about them. In fact, if they drew attention to themselves, they were probably going to be fired, because it wasn't about you, it was about that person who was in the spotlight. And you had to develop what was called the stage face or the show smirk. And that meant that, in fact, some casino entertainers would tell the musicians, make sure that you laugh when I tell a joke, make sure you clap when you're supposed to, smile, you better be paying attention, you better look like you're enjoying the show, even if you've heard the same thing the 2-week block and it's the last day of it, or you've seen me come back, you know, this is the 19th time you played with me, you better look like it's the first time and you've just never heard that joke before and you love it. So they had to lose the spotlight, and they had to act like they were, you know, completely engaged in what was happening. Now, I want to talk about the musicians in a particular way that came out when I started doing these interviews. I found this part of it the most fascinating. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I just found this next part the most interesting. And I call it the musician dichotomy, and it started with their education. And you had essentially two sides of the orchestra, and I'm going to talk about those two sides a little more in a minute, but you had I call it the string side, and that included all those stringed instruments and the harp. And then you had what I call the wind side, and I apologize to brass players and to percussionists, but I lump them all together as winds. So the ones who are, you know, blowing into instruments and beating on instruments, I call that side. What happened was you had a dichotomy in those two sides of the orchestra, and it started with the education. There was often a more stereotypical education, a conservatory, what you would expect to see, and that was often what you would see on the string side. They would go to a conservatory, they would go to Juilliard, they would go to, you know, a more traditional program. But then you had that other side, and you got to remember, these were 1950s, 1960s. There weren't so many jazz programs being offered or pop programs being offered in formal education in universities. So these people on that side of the orchestra usually pursued their education elsewhere. And a lot of them got their educations in the military. They would enter the military bands or orchestras, and they would play a lot of pop music, versatile music. They would travel. They became really fine musicians, and they developed a flexibility with doing things that you couldn't get at the time at a conservatory. So the types of backgrounds were completely different for many of them. That's not to say that there were string players who weren't in the military, but the bulk of the people I saw who were in the military were on the wind side. And also on the wind side, you had a resume that usually included playing with Glenn Miller, Harry James, Lawrence Welk. They had fabulous resumes. Whereas your string side, their resumes were good. They were playing in string quartets. They were playing in professional orchestras. They were teaching in schools and that kind of stuff. But again, there was a difference. Some of them also refined their skills by, if they lived in this area, they went to the casinos and they just watched. What did that drummer do? How did that piano player, seem to navigate the shows? They would just go and watch. And you could do that in those days. You could go in and watch a lounge act anytime you wanted, except one of the fellows I interviewed. He was a local Renoite. He was a percussionist, and he got his union card at the age of 13. And that was because in those days, he and his teacher were the only two drummers in the Reno area. And because of that, they were sought after. And so if there was a casino show, the way the rules worked was they had to hire a local union member, or at least try to hire them first. And if they couldn't, they needed more drummers than the two who were available, or those people weren't available, then they were allowed to go beyond Reno, start looking in Sacramento or San Francisco. Well, this guy joined at 13, and he became one of those people who played in the showrooms at 13. He was very restricted on where he could go in the casino, but he had incredible experience for a 13-year-old. And one of the things he used to do is, he said, he was local. He would go from one lounge act to the other, and he'd watch the drum players. He just wanted to see what they did. Well, he wasn't technically allowed to do that because he wasn't 21. And he said he went in one casino and he'd watch for a while, and the security guard would come up and tap him on the shoulder and said, "You got to get out of here. You're not old enough." He said he started knowing all the security guards on a first name basis. They knew him on a first name basis. They were doing their jobs. They had to make him leave. But he says, "I was kicked out of every casino in Reno at some time or another." So that was another way that people learned. This dichotomy was even recognized by some of the entertainers. It was very obvious. Sammy Davis used to walk in and he would say to the string players, and they're all in their tuxedos and everything, and he'd say, "Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad that you're with me this evening. Thank you for being here." And then he'd go over to the wind side. He'd say, "Hey, mothers, how you doing?" And he talked to the two sides completely differently. Pearl Bailey used to talk about the hotel side on the strings and the motel side on the winds. So it was recognized beyond the musicians themselves. And as I said, it had to do with their training, their education. It also had to do with their aspirations, their goals. The string players tended to be classical musicians. Many of them came to play in the casinos just to earn some quick money. I'm just going to do this for a couple of years, then I'm not going to stay because this is below me. One of the string players said it was prostituting himself. It was so below him. And they would view it that way, or they were paying off school loans from their conservatory. Whereas on the wind side, this was the top of the pyramid. This was as good as it got, except for being studio musicians playing first trumpet under Frank Sinatra. How much better could I be? So they completely viewed their jobs differently. Let's see what story I have on that. I think I pretty much covered it there. Yeah, they said on the wind side, they said you were a hot player if you were in the casino showrooms. There was no step up from there unless you wanted to be the star yourself. But at the same time, even though there was this split and there was this dichotomy, they did mix socially. In fact, many people married from both sides of the orchestras and that too. They did, and they also respected each other professionally. The wind side players would often go to watch the string players play in the chamber orchestra or in string quartets, and the wind players would have these little pickup impromptu sessions that they would play, and the string players would stay after the last show and watch them just do their I lost the word. Improvisation. Yeah. So they did respect each other and get along. And they did draw together in some of these shows. Some of these shows were pretty miserable. One of the things they would have to do, like I said, this is the 9th time I've had to play with that person, and their music is so boring. And, they called it footballs when they had these whole notes where they'd had to play long held notes. And so some of them were just not that comfortable, having done it so many times. And there were other things that were not as nice about the jobs. And so one of the things they would do is they pulled a lot of humor between the two sides, and they engaged and had fun, and they laughed a lot. And I have a whole section about the humor that was involved in making the shows more fun. They had spitball wars. They would pass gas, and the only people who would know it would be the entertainer and the musicians who were on the stage. And sometimes they would play jokes on the entertainers, but they had to be very careful who they did that with, because if you played a joke on somebody who could have you fired, that was it. It was their call, right? I mean, they could go to the conductor or the casino owner and say, that person did something rude, they're out of here. So you had to be very careful who you played a joke on. So they had to know the entertainers well enough to do that. And they usually reserved it for the end of the 2-week block. They would play jokes on the entertainers. One of the ones they talked about was the Paul Anka show. And Paul Anka had a habit. He would go and look at, for some reason, he would go to the brass musicians and that section, and he would look at the music that was on their music stand, and he would say to all the musicians, he would say, okay, are you guys ready to play this? And he would walk over and look at that music stand, and then he'd walk back out and he'd start singing. Well, one night, these brass players knew that he did that every night, so they decided they were going to play a joke on him. So they put an 8x10 pornographic picture on their music stand. So Paul Anka walks back, like he always did, to this music stand, and he's kind of talking to the audience. Well, tonight I thought I'd sing, and are you guys about, whoa, and he stops and he freezes, and he walks back out to the front of the stage to start to sing. And then before he starts to sing, he says, I need to check one more time and make sure they're ready. So he walked back and checked one more time. So, little things that they wouldn't get in trouble doing. But there was another joke that these two violin ladies, they were kind of fun to interview anyway, really neat ladies. And they decided to play a joke on Toady Fields. So Toady Fields, as I said, a lot of these entertainers would have routines that they would do. They always kind of asked or said the same thing night after night. And one of the things Toady Fields used to say that she thought was particularly funny was that she would want to point out that she would talk about that the right side of the chest of string players was well developed because they were always doing this with their bows. And so she had a very small string ensemble. She would only have 2 violins in her section. So one day, these 2 ladies decided that they were going to play a joke on her. So they went to Frederick's of Hollywood, and they bought falsies, just one for each of them. And they put it in the right side. So when Toady Fields used her regular line about how developed they were on the right side, these 2 girls, they stood up. And as the one said to me, "For rump," we were well developed on one side. She said, and that one of the musicians happened to have a husband in that area in the band, and he was very embarrassed that she did that. But she said that Toadie started laughing so hard that she wet her pants and she had to leave the stage. She was just laughing so hard. So she did not fire them. It was all taken in stride, and these ladies had,
Marilyn Sevilla and
so
probably Fidel was probably there. No, I don't know.
Now the musicians were so generous with their time. They are a generous, wonderful, talented. Many of them are gone now. In fact, some of them have passed away even while I was writing the book, and certainly since writing the book. But I think it's important to people who live in this area to know how blessed you've been to have these musicians grow your music scene in your community. And they have been generous in many ways, not just in music. I mean, the impact they've had on the schools, the impact they've had in their communities in general. I was so grateful to meet them, and I hope that you at least have gotten a glimpse of something I hope you appreciate and will think about in days to come. So I'd like to take any questions. Let me stop sharing the screen and take any questions or comments or anything. If you have been a casino employee or musician yourself, I hope you'll speak up and share some of your own experiences as well.
And if you don't have a mic, you can type it in the chat box.
Any questions?
Pat, I have a question. How would a musician find out about a job? Would he be contacted through the union or just by the word of mouth by other musicians about an opening?
It depended. A lot of it was by word of mouth, like this one fellow I was talking about who came to Vegas first, and then he ended up coming up to Tahoe. That was word of mouth. He heard about it through the Glenn Miller and Dorsey folks that he played with. But it was also through the union. In fact, if the casino was hiring for a particular show, and they called the union in, say, Sacramento and said, we need a musician for this show. We can't fill a slot. Do you have somebody there who might be able to come in? There was a woman. She was the first female musician. I have a picture in my book of a early, I'd say, we don't know exactly the date. It's probably late 50s, and it's all men. And she broke in as the first woman, and that's exactly how she was hired. She was in Sacramento. The union said, "Oh, we got just somebody for you." She comes here, and she's only going to do this temporarily, but it's pretty good money, and she's trying to kind of get away from a bad marriage. So she decides, okay, I think this will work. So she moves out here and stays. And she did talk about how it was to be the first woman, because a lot of the men in her section, she was a violinist, they did not want her to come in.
Thank you.
Pat,
Yeah.
Fred here.
Hi, Fred.
Yes, good to see you tonight. How many trips did you have to make across the country to interview these musicians? Because they're not all in Reno.
Most of them I did interview in this area. I didn't go across the country. I did go in parts of California. Brian Farnan was living outside of San Francisco. A conductor, and I did try to get with all the conductors I could as well. So most of them, and I know that I didn't get everybody. I know that.
Sure.
I would still be interviewing for the next 50 years if I got everybody. And what's funny, and the reason I say that is, and this happened so many times, I'd call these musicians, I'd say, I got your name from so-and-so, and I'd like to come and ask you some questions about being a casino musician. And they'd say, oh, honey, I don't remember much about it. And I probably, you're only going to be here for 10 minutes. This is going to be the shortest interview you ever knew. And I'd get there and I'd start asking them questions about it. And it'd be 2 hours, and as much as 6 hours later, they'd be closing down, and they'd say, I can't believe I remembered all that. Boy, once I started talking about that. So they took a long time, each one. And some people I would have to schedule second interviews because they had very good recollection. They were very articulate about their memories, and I had to, get back with them.
Did you use a tape recorder?
I did, yes. And I transcribed every single word, and my plan is to donate the transcriptions, minus anything they asked me to keep private, to donate them to an archive so that those are on record too.
Historic.
Yeah. And nothing about this history has ever been written. And you'll get a sense of it if you read the book. It is a very unique population of people. And yes, there's the book. And it needed to be documented. I just decided after I wrote it, I shouldn't say this, but I didn't care if anybody read it. I needed to get it in writing. It needed to be made permanent so that, 100 years from now, people would know what this is like. It really is a fascinating history.
Mina, is the book available in the museum bookstore?
Yes, that was what I was about to say. Is if you'd like to buy a copy of Casino Sideman by Patricia Crane, pardon me, they are available at the Nevada State Museum store. And of course, you would be supporting your Nevada State Museum, buying it there rather than somewhere else. Anyway, and of course, like I said before, if you're become a member of the museum, you get early announcements for these kind of things. And right, do members have a discount in the store?
We should. I think we
Yes.
used to.
Yes, they
I
do.
think so. I
I'm
think it's
sorry.
like 10% or I can't remember,
Yes.
but I believe so.
So, yes. So how are we all doing? I'm getting a little tired, but only 3 people have actually left since you stopped talking. So I guess everybody's all,
There's the members get 15% off, and once a year, Charmaine gives 20.
Ooh. It's worth it just to meet Charmaine.
anyway, any more questions?
I just want to thank Pat for her enthusiasm. The love of what you wrote about comes through, and that makes it very, very pleasant to hear the stories and hear the history. And I pretty much grew up in Reno, and it was fun. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was very interesting.
Thank you from the Buglys.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
So much.
thank you.
So if there's no more comments, you're welcome to stay and chat for a little bit, but you're also welcome to sign off and go to
Okay.
sleep.
Good night.
Good night.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Henry.
much for being here. Thank you so much.
And I'll be
I'd like to
emailing
make a
everyone for the
contact-
next one.
Perfect.
Okay.
Oh, what
Well,
fun.
thank you. Thank you very much, Pat.
Oh, you're
Um,
welcome. That was great fun. Because of the virus, I haven't done one in a while, so it was good to get me back on here, back on the horse.
I'm always trying to,
Are you?
get people with different backgrounds interested in the museum. So like I did an aviation lecture and we did a theater lecture. And so, along with the Buglies and the Jazz and Beyond Festival, we're trying to get the musical people interested in the museum and such. So
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, well, and it just shows too that you don't have to be a musician to enjoy some of these things, There's something for
You said you
everybody.
recorded this session. Is it going to be available for members who couldn't attend tonight?
Okay, so there's only 11 of us left. So yes, we are working on creating a museum YouTube page and putting these videos on the YouTube page. I am sorry that everything in museums goes really, really slowly, but it also has to do with the fact that we got budget cuts and we don't have as much time. So
Yeah.
it is coming, the YouTube page and the posting of these videos. I can't say when though, I'm sorry.
Terrific, thank you. And Pat, thank you so much. It was an absolutely outstanding lecture. And I can't wait to read the book.
Good, good.
And I cruise a lot, and I can say that the show bands on cruise ships have to have all of these things that you mentioned, the versatility and the, that they performers come in new every week and every day of the week, and they have to adapt, and they're amazing showmen, musicians on the cruise line.
That's a hard life too, because they're traveling so much, and it's sort of like being with the Glenn Miller Band and all those others. It's a tough life, it takes a special person.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank
Good
you.
Make sure to visit the Nevada State Museum store.
Thank you, Vanna White.
And this one that Charm let me take out of the store is not signed by the author, but I'm
Oh,
sure we
no.
could get signed copies from the
We need to
author.
change that.
Oh, I don't get to keep this. I have to put it back in the store. But yes, you could sign it and then she could sell it as a signed copy. But
I will do that. I have done that before, yes. And I can visit with Charmaine too.
anyway, like I said, we do have, of course, another lecture in October. And she also wrote a book. So I'll be doing my shameless plugs. But you're perfectly welcome to come to the museum and buy the book before the lecture too.
Ooh.
And I'll be sending that email out soon for
Nice.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Mina.
Good to see you. Lovely.
Okay. Yeah, I guess so.
All right. Well, I guess the rest of us are signing off then, huh?
Okay, yeah.
Have a lovely weekend.
You
It's
too.
very nice. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you. Yes.
All right. I'll get to the bookstore. I'll put that on my list of things to do. All right.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.